The story of the death of Jesus of Nazareth is usually told as a religious icon, focused on betrayal, faith, and divine destiny. But if we set the mysticism aside and look only at the concrete documented facts, what we find is the most complex, cynical, and well-planned criminal case of the last 2,000 years. A case in which the verdict was decided long before any crime was officially committed. This is a different kind of investigation. Here, theology gives way to forensic criminal work, applied directly to the historical data. To understand who really eliminated Jesus, the prayer books are set aside. What counts now is cold logic and data analysis. Our analysis tool, Axiom, cross-referenced information from thousands of documents including texts by historians such as Flavius Josephus and Tacitus, accounts from the Gospels, Roman legal codes, and archaeological reports. This tool can pull together scattered information and model the social processes of the past to give us a clear view of the facts. The first conclusion the system delivers is blunt and disturbing. In the year 30, the geopolitical situation in Judea made the elimination of a figure like Jesus a statistical inevitability. It was not an accident of fate, nor merely prophecy. It was a system correction that the ruling power needed to carry out in order to maintain order. To understand the real motive behind this killing, we need to examine the crime scene. And we are not talking about the site of the execution, but about the entire province of Judea in the 1st century. Forget the calm images of shepherds in the fields that we see in paintings. The data reconstruct a brutal reality. Judea at that time was an economic disaster zone under constant political tension. It was a powder keg waiting to go off. For the Roman Empire, that small province was not culturally important. It was simply a dangerous border zone that caused trouble. The Romans wanted only 2 things from it: taxes paid on time and silence. They needed safe trade routes and no revolts. But silence was impossible. The data on the tax burden explain the reason for the tension. The ordinary citizen of Judea handed over almost half of everything he produced to pay taxes. It was a double stranglehold. On one side, the tribute to Rome, the land tax and the tolls charged on every road and bridge. On the other side, the religious tax. Every Jew was required to pay the tithe to the temple in Jerusalem. In practice, the temple worked as a national bank and as the center of the local economy. Axiom's analysis shows that by the time Jesus began to act publicly, the vast majority of the population was living in absolute misery. People were losing their land over debts, and families were being torn apart to pay creditors. The level of anger and radicalization in society was extreme. Everyone was waiting for a violent change. They were waiting for the Messiah. This is where our modern perception makes a fundamental mistake. In the 1st century, the word Messiah sounded very different from the peaceful meaning we know today. For a Jew of that era, it was a battle cry. The Messiah was supposed to be a warrior king, a new David who would physically destroy the Roman legions, drive out the occupiers, and restore the greatness of Israel by the strength of the sword. History records dozens of rebel leaders who tried exactly that, gathering armies and being slaughtered by the Roman military machine. Into this chaotic scene steps Jesus of Nazareth. But Axiom flags an anomaly in his behavior that baffled the Romans and the Jewish elite alike. He did not fit the profile of the standard rebel. He did not call for open war against Rome. When questioned about taxes, he gave a politically skillful answer so as not to be arrested for sedition. He did not arm his followers. For the governor, Pontius Pilate, this was confusing. Roman bureaucracy knew how to handle violence, but it had no idea how to classify a threat that talked about loving your enemies. For the temple aristocracy in Jerusalem, however, Jesus represented a real financial danger. The official version says they hated him over religious questions, but economic analysis suggests a far stronger motive. The problem was money. The upper caste of priests controlled the temple, which was a gigantic industrial complex. During the festivals, the sale of sacrificial animals and the exchange of currency generated enormous profits. The family of the former high priest Annas controlled that market. Then Jesus carries out an action that Axiom identifies as a direct attack on the elite's vault, driving the merchants out of the temple. It was not just a moment of religious anger, it was a financial blow. He called their business a den of thieves in front of everyone, threatening the legitimacy of the priest's profits. In that moment, his fate was sealed. He had attacked the monopoly of the most powerful people in the nation. High Priest Caiaphas was an official appointed by Rome, and he knew his power was fragile. If there was disorder or any loss of control over the crowd, Rome would remove him from office and send troops into the sanctuary. Caiaphas's decision was purely political. He needed to sacrifice one man to keep his position and avoid a Roman military intervention. It was a crisis management decision. The problem was timing. It was the eve of Passover, and Jerusalem was packed with more than 150,000 pilgrims. Jesus' popularity among ordinary people was immense. Arresting him during the day would set off an immediate riot, exactly what Caiaphas wanted to avoid. The authorities needed a surgical operation. They needed to remove him quietly, at night, isolate him from his supporters, and condemn him quickly before the people woke up. The trap was set, but there was a logistical problem. Jesus did not sleep in the same place, and he was hard to locate in the crowded city at night. They needed someone who knew his routine and could guide the guards. They needed an inside man in the inner circle. Analysis of the group of apostles singles out Judas Iscariot. The story says he betrayed for greed, but our analysis indicates that the sum paid was far too insignificant for the risk. There was something more complex at work in this man's mind, a motivation far more complex than the story usually tells. In the history of criminal investigation, there are names that become synonymous with the crimes they committed, but there is one particular name that carries a heavier weight, tied to the deepest betrayal a human being can commit: Judas. For 2 millennia, tradition has painted him as the embodiment of pure evil, a man who sold his master and friend out of greed. Yet when we strip away the religious emotion and apply the cold logic of an investigator, a question emerges that the official accusation has never managed to answer satisfactorily. Where is the real motive? But to solve this problem without setting off a popular uprising, the authorities needed an operative inside the circle of trust. They needed Judas Iscariot. The classic version, the one we all know, says that Judas simply loved money more than loyalty. But we fed all the available data on Judas, on the financial system of first-century Judea, and on the psychological profiles of revolutionaries of that era into our analytical matrix, Axiom. The system ran a cross-referenced behavioral and economic analysis. The first conclusion that appears on the monitor invalidates the simple greed thesis. The financial motive is statistically unsustainable. The answer begins with the sum paid, 30 pieces of silver. It sounds like a fortune in ancient stories, but what did that amount represent in the real market of the time? Axiom processed the numismatic and purchasing power data. We are probably talking about Tyrian shekels, the only coin with silver pure enough to be accepted in the temple. Converted into the wages and cost of living of the year 30, that sum was no treasure. Under ancient law, specifically in the book of Exodus, 30 pieces of silver was the fixed compensation for a slave killed by accident. It was not the price of a king, nor of a prophet, nor even of a free citizen. It was the price of a slave. In today's economic terms, it would be the equivalent of a few months of minimum wage for a manual laborer. It was not enough money to buy a luxury property or secure a comfortable retirement. The logic of the situation simply does not add up. The group's treasurer, the man Jesus trusted with the bag holding the donations, someone who had witnessed or believed he had witnessed astonishing miracles, would sell all of that for such a low price. Axiom rates the probability of that motive as negligible. Greed does not balance the books here. The rabbit hole goes deeper. The real motive, however, was not in the money. It was in the profile of the suspect. Who was Judas? Linguistic and geographical analysis of his surname Iscariot reveals a crucial detail. Most of the apostles, such as Peter, James, and John, were Galileans. They were men of the north, fishermen, rural, known for being emotional and direct. Judas was different. Iscariot probably derives from Iscariot, man of Kerioth. Kerioth was a town in the south in Judea. That means Judas was the only Judean among the 12. He was the only city man, coming from the region where the center of power and religion stood. This creates a completely different group dynamic. Axiom's psychological module points to a likely feeling of isolation. He was the odd man out, perhaps better educated, more cynical, looking at the northern fisherman with a certain sense of superiority. There is also a second possibility in the analysis of the name, one our tool considers vital. The root of the word may be linked to the Latin term sicarius. The sicarii were the radical wing of the zealots, political insurgents who carried short daggers under their robes to eliminate Romans and collaborators in the middle of crowds. If Judas had ties to that political underworld, or sympathized with its ideology, his presence at Jesus' side takes on a different meaning. Judas, like many patriots of the time, was not just looking for a teacher of morals. He was looking for a liberator. He saw Jesus calm storms and feed thousands. To a politically motivated mind, that is not merely a religious miracle, it is a perfect military asset. A leader who solves the army's food logistics and heals the wounded on the battlefield is invincible. Axiom models Judas's emotional state in the last week before the arrest. The graph shows a classic curve of disillusionment. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem was the peak of hope. The crowd was shouting, and it looked as though the revolution would start right there. But what happened next? Jesus did not order an attack on the Roman fortress. He went to the temple, caused an uproar, and then started talking about sacrifice and surrender. He was refusing political power. To Judas's pragmatic, revolutionary mind, this was a disaster. The Messiah was wasting a historic opportunity. This is where the hypothesis comes in that explains everything with far more logic than simple betrayal. It is the forced hand theory. What if Judas did not want Jesus' death? What if, in fact, he wanted his victory at any cost? An extremist's reasoning follows a dangerous and unexpected path. The master is powerful, but he is too much of a pacifist. He hesitates. He needs a push. If I put him in a life or death situation, if I bring the Roman soldiers to him, he will have no choice. He will be forced to use his divine power to defend himself. He will call down fire from heaven, crush his enemies, and the kingdom of Israel will finally begin. This explains why Judas accepted the 30 coins. It was not for profit, but to formalize the contract with the priests, guaranteeing that the soldiers really would be sent. He was manipulating the situation, trying to force a miracle by way of a crisis. He gambled with history, betting everything. Judas's tragedy was a monumental miscalculation. They were speaking different languages. Judas spoke the language of war and strategy. Jesus spoke a language Judas could not decode. This brings us to the technical details of the operation. What exactly were the priests paying for? Jesus was a public figure known to everyone in Jerusalem. There was no need to pay anyone to identify him. What Judas sold was not the identity, it was the logistics. The value of the information lay in the where and the when. The priests needed a window of opportunity away from the crowd. They needed to know exactly where Jesus would be isolated, in the dark, so they could carry out an extraction with no witnesses. The Garden of Gethsemane, a private walled space, was the perfect blind spot. Judas's reaction after the conviction confirms our analysis. Had he been nothing but a cynical mercenary, he would have taken the money and vanished into the crowd of pilgrims. But the records show the opposite. When he saw that Jesus had been condemned, and note that carefully condemned and not striking back with divine power as he had expected, he collapsed. The plan had failed. The master did not fight. He gave himself up. The remorse described in the ancient texts uses words that indicate a total change of mind, a deep horror at the mistake he had made. He runs back to the priests, tries to return the money, shouting that he has betrayed innocent blood. That is not the behavior of a man who has struck a good deal. It is the despair of someone whose political plan has ended in disaster. The priest's response was one of icy cynicism. They said, "What is that to us? That is your problem." The tool had been used and discarded. Judas throws the coins onto the floor of the temple. The sound of that silver striking the stone was the final sound of his defeat. The fate of those 30 coins closes the circle of hypocrisy that Axiom detected. The priests, so strict about religious law, could not put the money back into the sacred treasury because it was blood money. They could pay for a murder, but they could not accept the change. With that money they bought a plot of land out of the way to bury destitute foreigners. The place became known as Akeldama, the field of blood. Judas Iscariot is not the cartoon villain of children's stories. The analysis reveals a complex, broken man, a victim of his own arrogance and of the political illusions of his time. He became the perfect operative for the system precisely because his internal contradictions made him easy to manipulate. He thought he was in control, that he was speeding history along, but he was only a piece being moved by far more experienced players. Agent Iscariot had done his job. The information was delivered. The location was confirmed. Now diplomacy and strategy are over. Brute force takes the stage. In the next stage, we will leave the darkened offices behind and step out into the open air, beneath the ancient olive trees. We will examine the military operation at Gethsemane and understand why arresting a single unarmed man required mobilizing a force capable of starting a war. The night is only just beginning. The image we have of that night is usually a silent one, a peaceful garden under the moonlight. But the historical data fed into Axiom reveal the opposite. If we could capture the sound of that moment, we would not hear crickets, but the rhythmic noise of hundreds of boots marching, the metal of armor and the crackle of torches. It was not a simple police action. It was a large-scale military operation. We arrive at the Garden of Olives, Gethsemane. Tradition calls the event an arrest, but our tactical analysis classifies it as a military extraction with disproportionate use of force. The numbers behind the operation are startling. How many men does it take to arrest an unarmed carpenter and 11 exhausted followers? The original Greek text uses the word spaera to describe the troop Judas was leading. Translators soften this to band, but Axiom consulted military manuals from the period. Spaera is the technical term for a Roman cohort. The standard strength of a cohort was 600 soldiers. Even if the unit was not at full strength, we are talking about at least 200 professional legionaries equipped for war. Added to them were the temple guard, the religious police armed with clubs, and the priests' servants. The simulation shows that an army of 300 to 600 men was mobilized against a group of civilians. The system highlights an obvious question: why such overkill? The answer is fear. The organizers were terrified of two things. First, the possibility of a revolt among the crowd of pilgrims camped in the surrounding area. Second, they were afraid of Jesus himself. The reports of his miracles, especially the raising of Lazarus nearby, frightened the elite. They did not know what to expect. What if he used supernatural powers? Against the possibility of magic, they sent a battalion of steel. The presence of the Roman cohort reveals a crucial political fact. The temple guard answered to the priests, but Roman soldiers answered only to the governor. High priest Caiaphas could not mobilize imperial troops on his own. This proves that the order came directly from Pontius Pilate, or was authorized by him. The conspiracy was not merely religious. It was an unprecedented partnership between the Roman state and the temple. The location, Gethsemane, was walled, private ground. Tactically, a perfect trap, hard to escape from. Judas knew the place and guided the soldiers with precision. They arrived with torches, expecting to have to hunt down fugitives hiding in caves, but Jesus walked out to meet them. Here we come to the episode of the kiss, which Axiom shows to have been a purely tactical necessity, far removed from any affection. In the dark and the confusion, it was easy to seize the wrong man. The order was to capture the leader alive. Judas had to get close and mark the target for the soldiers. The kiss was the visual identification for the capture team. When Jesus identifies himself, there is a failure in protocol. The troop draws back and some of them fall. Axiom reads this as a collective psychological shock. Tense soldiers, expecting to face a dangerous sorcerer, were confronted with absolute calm. But Roman professionalism regained control quickly, and the ring closed in. It was then that the disciples reacted. Peter draws a weapon, and the analysis suggests a curved dagger or a large knife, and attacks. He did not wound just any soldier. The victim, Malchus, was the personal servant of the high priest, which indicates that he was a high-ranking officer of the temple guard. Peter tried to kill an officer of the law. By the rules of the time, that would have justified the immediate execution of every disciple standing there. Why did the massacre not happen? Axiom concludes that the only reason was Jesus' intervention. He stopped the fight, ordered the sword put away, and, according to the accounts, healed the officer's wound. That act broke the script of violence. The soldiers were prepared to fight, but they had no idea how to react to a prisoner who heals his enemy. That moment of confusion allowed the disciples to escape, and escape they did, in a panic, abandoning their master in the darkness of the Kidron Valley. The main target was restrained and treated as a highly dangerous terrorist. The commander of the troop, a tribune, a senior rank that confirms the seriousness of the mission, ordered the withdrawal. Now the legal nightmare begins. It was somewhere between midnight and 1 in the morning. By law, a prisoner should have been held in a cell until daybreak, but they took him straight to the house of the high priest. It was a legalized kidnapping. Speed was vital. They needed a formal conviction before the city woke up and realized what had happened. It was not an ordinary arrest. It was a state operation. Peter's armed resistance nearly caused a disaster, but it was neutralized by the defendant himself. Jesus is now in enemy custody, and the most unjust trial in history is about to begin. Justice is usually pictured as a blindfolded woman, impartial. But what took place in Jerusalem in the hours before dawn that Friday had nothing impartial about it. In our database, Axiom classifies this event as a judicial murder. Forget modern courtrooms with lawyers and rights. Jesus was dragged into a private mansion in the wealthy part of the city, where the elite of the Sanhedrin was waiting for him for a trial whose verdict had already been written before it began. We loaded into Axiom the text of the Mishnah, the code of laws that governed the Jewish judicial system of the period. Comparing what the law required with what the judges actually did, the result is scandalous. The system identified 18 fatal violations of the penal code. Any one of them should have annulled the proceedings. Let us audit that night. The first violation was the hour. The law strictly forbade capital trials at night because darkness favors error. But they tried Jesus before dawn in a hurry, before the city woke up. The second was the calendar. It was the eve of Passover, and courts were forbidden to sit on holy days. They broke their own sacred calendar. The third violation was the venue. The Sanhedrin could only pronounce a death sentence in the official chamber of the temple. Jesus was tried in the living room of the high priest Caiaphas. It was a clandestine meeting, not a legitimate court. Then there was the question of witnesses. The prosecution depended on 2 witnesses in agreement. They brought in people who had been paid, and even so they could not get the stories to line up. The case was falling apart for lack of evidence. Jesus remained silent, which irritated the judges more than any outburst could have. Caiaphas, seeing the proceedings sink, committed the gravest violation of all. He demanded that the defendant incriminate himself. Under the law, no one could be convicted on his own confession. But Caiaphas asked the fatal question under oath, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" It was a trap. If Jesus said no, he lost everything. If he said yes, it was blasphemy. Jesus answers by quoting a prophecy from Daniel, declaring that he would be seated at the right hand of the power, a substitute for the name of God. That was a claim to divine equality. Caiaphas tore his robes, another illegal act for a high priest, and forced the vote. The vote was irregular too. It should have begun with the youngest members, but Caiaphas imposed his own will first. The verdict for death was unanimous. Curiously, the Talmud says that if a defendant is convicted without a single vote in his favor, he must be released, because that indicates bias in the court. Every one of them voted for death, proving the conspiracy. The sentence was immediate, ignoring the legally required day of reflection in capital cases. What followed was a total loss of dignity. Respected judges began to spit at the defendant and strike him. Meanwhile, out in the courtyard, Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times, destroyed by fear. Axiom's audit is conclusive. That was not justice, it was bureaucratic elimination. But Caiaphas had a problem. The Sanhedrin had no power to execute anyone. Rome had stripped them of that right. They needed the Roman governor to kill Jesus. But Pilate did not care about religious blasphemy. Caiaphas needed to change the charge. He had a few hours to turn a religious heretic into a political danger to the empire. They needed to convince the Roman wolf to do the dirty work. The case now leaves the priest's hands and lands on the desk of the most powerful man in Judea, the governor, Pontius Pilate. The rules are different now. The sun was rising over Jerusalem, bringing a cold wind that scattered the mist of dawn. The city was waking up to the holiest day of the year, with no idea that those stones would be marked forever. We continue our investigation. Axiom has closed the audit of Caiaphas's illegal court. Now the focus shifts to the center of imperial power in the city, the Praetorium. We come to the 5th stage, Pilate's dilemma. Who was this man really? Popular culture created the image of a weary, indecisive philosopher who tried to save an innocent man. But the historical records of Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus reveal a very different profile. The real Pontius Pilate was a hard, cynical, and often cruel soldier who governed a hostile province and hated every minute of it. Philo describes his rule as a sequence of bribes, thefts, and executions without trial. On one occasion, to put down a protest, he planted soldiers in disguise among the crowd who beat hundreds of people to death. That was the man Jesus met that morning. So why do the Gospels show him hesitating? Axiom suggests it was not humanism, it was politics. Pilate despised the Jewish elite. When they brought Jesus to him, his first reaction was automatic. If these priests want to kill someone, perhaps I can use that to annoy them. The scene of the prisoner's handover is the height of hypocrisy. The priests take Jesus to the gate of the palace, but refuse to go inside, so as not to become ritually unclean before Passover. Men who had just rigged a death sentence and broken 18 laws were worried about ritual purity. They stayed out in the street while they handed a man over to be killed. Pilate is forced to come out and he asks, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" He needs a legal basis. And here is where the central fraud of the conviction takes place. Before the Sanhedrin, Jesus had been condemned for religious blasphemy, but the priests know that means nothing to Roman law. So they change the charge on the spot. They present 3 new crimes: inciting revolt, forbidding taxes, and declaring himself king. The third accusation was lethal. The Roman law of laesa majestas was clear. There was only one king in the empire, Tiberius. Anyone who called himself king without permission was a traitor. That turned the case from a religious dispute into a crime of high treason against the state. Pilate questions Jesus. "Are you the king of the Jews?" The tone suggests sarcasm. He sees a poor, unarmed man. Jesus' answer disarms Pilate's security protocol. "My kingdom is not of this world." To the governor's pragmatic mind, that meant Jesus was no military threat. Pilate realizes he is dealing with a harmless philosopher, not a rival to Caesar. Pilate announces to the crowd, "I find no crime in this man." But the priests increase the pressure, shouting that he has been stirring up the people ever since Galilee. Hearing Galilee, Pilate sees a bureaucratic way out. Galilee was the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, who was in the city. Pilate tries to get rid of the problem by sending the case to him. But the problem came back. Jesus was returned by Herod, and Pilate found himself cornered again. The crowd was growing and turning aggressive. Pilate had a legion, but using force during Passover, with the city packed, could start a war. He needed a diplomatic solution. He tries to negotiate, offering a severe punishment in exchange for the man's life. The Roman scourging, brutal as it was meant to satisfy the crowd's thirst for blood without killing the defendant. Pilate wanted to show them a broken Jesus and say, "Look, he has already paid." But the crowd was already past the point of no return. They did not want blood, they wanted death. Then the priests play their final card. They shout, "If you release him, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who makes himself king is against Caesar." It was a direct threat of political denunciation. The Emperor Tiberius was paranoid, executing anyone suspected of treason. Pilate knew his own position was fragile. If a letter reached Rome saying he had protected a usurper, he was a dead man. Axiom calculates the equation running through Pilate's head. On one side, the life of an innocent man. On the other, his own career and his own life. The choice was obvious. Justice was a luxury he could not afford. Pilate prepares to give in, but first he calls for water and washes his hands in front of everyone. He used a Jewish ritual to mock the accusers, transferring the guilt onto them. The crowd accepts it, shouting that the blood should fall on them. Pilate was not a victim. He was an accomplice. He knew the truth, but he sold an innocent man to save his post. The case was decided. But before the final sentence, there was that brief interlude of the meeting with Herod, the fox. In any system of power, when a decision is dangerous, the rule is to delegate. Pontius Pilate, cornered by pressure from the priests, tried to use that tactic. On learning that the accused came from Galilee, he saw a legal loophole to rid himself of the problem. We enter the sixth stage of the investigation, the Herod factor and the choice of the crowd. It is a moment of unique psychological complexity. Axiom tracks the prisoner being taken from the Roman court to the palace where Herod Antipas was staying. Antipas, son of the great tyrant Herod, was a weak ruler whom Jesus once called a fox, which in the culture of the time was an insult describing someone treacherous but cowardly, a political conman without the strength of a lion. The meeting between the fox and the lamb was an anticlimax for the king. Herod did not want justice. He wanted entertainment. Haunted by the guilt of having executed John the Baptist, he feared that Jesus might be the prophet returned. But seeing him in chains, all he wanted was a magic trick. "Perform a miracle," he asked. But Jesus stayed completely silent. He had debated with priests and talked with Pilate, yet to Herod he did not say a word. Axiom interprets this as the harshest moral judgment in the entire proceedings. With Pilate, an ignorant pagan, there was dialogue. With Herod, who knew the truth and killed it on a whim, there was nothing left to say. Jesus treated him as someone spiritually dead. Humiliated by the silence, Herod chooses mockery instead of execution. He has Jesus dressed in a resplendent robe, probably an old white tunic. The color white worn by political candidates in Rome was a visual joke. "You want a king? Here is your candidate." Herod turned him into a harmless caricature and sent him back to Pilate, with the political message that the man was mad, not dangerous. Jesus returns to the praetorium. Pilate's maneuver has failed. The crowd is now bigger and more aggressive. Pilate tries his last card, the Passover amnesty, offering the people the choice between releasing Jesus or a prisoner named Barabbas. Axiom corrects the traditional view that Barabbas was an ordinary thief. The historical term used was lestes, a word that designated armed insurgents. Barabbas was a rebel leader, an urban guerrilla who had killed Roman soldiers. To many people there, he was a hero of the resistance. Analysis of the manuscripts reveals a disturbing coincidence. Barabbas's full name was Jesus Barabbas. Bar Abba means son of the Father. The scene is symmetrical. Pilate sets two men named Jesus side by side. One is the Son of the Heavenly Father, preaching love and a spiritual kingdom. The other is the Jesus who is son of the earthly Father, preaching revolution, hatred, and a political kingdom won by force. Without meaning to, Pilate had organized a plebiscite on what kind of salvation the people wanted, and they chose violence. They shouted for Barabbas. Axiom dismantles the myth of the fickle crowd. These were not the same people who welcomed Jesus on the Sunday. His Galilean supporters were outside the city. The crowd at the trial was the urban elite, temple officials and professional agitators mobilized by the priests. They chose Barabbas because he stood for immediate action against Rome. Jesus, wounded and silent, looked weak to people who wanted revenge. Pilate lost. The logic of the crowd won. He releases the murderer and hands over the innocent man. Barabbas walks out of prison and sees the man who is going to die in his place. He was the first person to be literally saved by the death of Christ. The sentence is delivered with the words, "Ibis ad crucem." Politics ends here. What begins now is the pure, cold engineering of death. Roman bureaucracy finished its work with Pilate's sentence. Politics gave way to engineering. We enter the final and most brutal phase of the investigation, the mechanics of Golgotha. Many people think they know how Jesus died, based on centuries of religious art. But Axiom, loaded with forensic data, sketches a different scenario. What happened on that hill outside Jerusalem was not a solemn ceremony, but a technical torture procedure designed by specialists in anatomy to maximize agony and delay death. Jesus is taken outside the city. The medical analysis indicates a critical condition. The Roman scourging with the flagrum caused hypovolemic shock. He lost a great deal of blood and fluid. His body was already collapsing before he reached the site, which is why he could not carry the crossbeam and needed the help of Simon of Cyrene. The crucifixion begins. Axiom corrects an error of sacred art. The nails did not go through the hands. The bone structure of the hand cannot bear the weight of a body. The flesh would tear. The Romans knew this. The nails were driven into the wrists, striking the median nerve. The pain is comparable to a continuous electric shock running up the arm. But pain was not the cause of death. The cross kills by asphyxiation. The position of the body holds the rib cage in a state of inhalation. Air goes in, but it does not come out. To exhale, the victim has to make a colossal effort, pushing the body upward on the nailed feet. It is a cycle of terror. To breathe, you have to trigger the unbearable pain in your feet. If you relax, you suffocate. Jesus fought against this for 6 hours. Carbon dioxide built up in his blood, producing acidosis and cramps that locked up his limbs. His heart was beating irregularly, trying to pump blood that was running short. Axiom highlights a temporal anomaly. A normal crucifixion lasted for days. Victims died of exhaustion or thirst. Jesus died fast in a matter of hours, which surprised Pilate. What caused that accelerated death? The answer lies in the Roman soldier's spear. To make sure of death, he pierced the side of the body and out came blood and water. To forensic medicine, the water was fluid from the pericardium. This suggests an acute cardiac rupture caused by extreme stress. In precise medical terms, his heart did not simply stop. It ruptured under physical and emotional pressure. The case is technically closed. We have the body, the cause, and the perpetrators. But Axiom still has to issue the final verdict of guilt. Who is the real killer? The system processes the responsibility of each actor. First, Judas Iscariot. He was the tool, the one who set it in motion. His guilt is betrayal, but he lost control of the process. He was a catalyst, not the architect. Secondary responsibility. Second, Caiaphas and the priestly elite. They were the architects. They had the motive, power, and money. They planned the conspiracy, and they broke the laws. They acted with premeditated malice. The greatest moral and legal responsibility is theirs. Third, Pontius Pilate, the executioner. He had the authority to stop the injustice, and he knew the defendant was innocent. His guilt is administrative cowardice and political opportunism. He sanctioned the crime to save his career. Fourth, the crowd, the weapon. Manipulated and blind, they chose the criminal Barabbas. Theirs is the guilt of collective ignorance. It looks like a crime of shared responsibility. But in the final second, Axiom flags something unexpected. The pattern of an ordinary victim does not fit. In a crucifixion, the victim usually dies unable to speak from lack of air. But Jesus, at the final moment, gave a loud cry. He was conscious. He said, "It is finished." And his last words were not words of defeat, but of active surrender. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." The semantic analysis is crucial. He did not say, My life is being taken from me. He handed it over. Axiom concludes that, despite the conspiracy and the torture, no one took his life by force. He controlled the exact moment of his own death. He waited until everything was fulfilled and allowed death to touch him. That changes the verdict. It was not a murder in which the victim was overpowered. It was an operation in which the principal agent infiltrated death in order to break it. The victim was the only free man there. Pilate wrote a sign for the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. He did it to irritate the religious leaders, but Axiom closes the file by confirming that this sign, written by a cynical politician, was the only true statement in the entire proceedings. The investigation ends here. The political, economic, and biological motivations have been laid bare. The most famous case in history was not a legal accident. It was an event in which human evil reached its peak, only to be used for a greater purpose. The file is closed. The rest is up to you. If you like this investigation, subscribing to the channel helps us expand the Axiom investigation project. We would love to read your thoughts on the video's subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end.